afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. You are at the second webinar of the Southern California chapter of ASLA. I'm Elisa Moffett. I'm the chair of the Climate Action Committee. And today's webinar is Fire Resilience Through Grassland Restoration and Regenerative Grazing. First, we'll hear from Jack Anderson, who founded Cuyama Lamb with his wife, Jenya Schneider. I had the pleasure of meeting both of them when they worked with Santa Barbara County Fire Department on fuel management in Tepesquei Canyon. Seeing the process of regenerative grazing was not only inspiring, but delightful, something that sheep bring to the process that machinery doesn't. And then we will hear from Lauren Harris, who is the staff ecologist for the Channel Islands Restoration, and she will tell us about their grassland restoration project in the San Marcos Foothills Preserve in the Wildland Urban Interface of Santa Barbara. This project was credited by the Santa Barbara County Fire Chief with saving a nearby neighborhood from the cave fire in November 2019, which is why this is of particular interest to us at this point in time. After Jack and Lauren speak, they will take questions, and we will also perhaps be joined later on by a board member of the Santa Barbara Fire Safe Council to answer questions from the fire management perspective. So without further ado, I will pass the mic on to Jack. Thank you, Jack.
Hey, thank you so much, Alyssa, and thanks for everyone for coming in. I'm excited to talk to you guys. I'll go ahead and share. All right. Okay, so yeah, we started Cuyama Lamb in 2018. We were based out of Cuyama Valley, which is where our names comes from, and focused on native grassland restoration in the dry desert there. This here, though, is out at the White Buffalo Land Trust in Halama Canyon on the Santa Barbara coast here. This was what the Cuyama Desert looked more like. Very harsh, very dry environment. But that just happens to be exactly the kind of environment, dry Mediterranean environment, that sheep come from. And so they're not only really well adapted to be in those environments, but also those environments, those dryland environments, are very much adapted, particularly grasslands, to periodic disturbance and grazing. In fact, it's that disturbance of those grasslands which maintains them and prevents them from succeeding into other environments. So we started this flock intentionally to be a managed disturbance that goes into grasslands, and like this environment where it's very shrubby, opens it up and helps remove some leaf litter and improve these native grasslands. You can see in the bottom there some of the beautiful native grasses that are really struggling out there in the desert. Very quickly after getting this thing started, we started a relationship with Channel Island Restoration, and we helped do a management plan which involved using sheep for grazing on the San Marcos Foothills Preserve. The San Marcos Foothills is extremely special place where there are a number of stacked native grasslands that are really rare and really important to protect. So there's been a long history of native grassland preservation there, and Channel Island has been doing that management for the county since it's been owned by the county. And this grant that we got to do native grassland management there, this was particularly focused on improving ground nesting bird habitat. So the idea was to remove a lot of the thick thatch and to try to create more of a plant composition that those native birds that were becoming more scarce, or in some cases had stopped occurring in those places, would be more inclined to nest and to be present there. You can see on the right there a big, beautiful bunch of Stipopulchra at the preserve. One of the predominant issues with native grasslands right now, I mean, we have a number of issues, but one of the huge ones and the ones that the sheep can help us with the most is the management of these annual invasives. You guys are probably familiar with black mustard there. Can stack so huge, can be 12 feet tall, can really shade out and pressure any native plants. Is really tough competition for these natives, and regular management is the only way to be able to convert these types of environments. I mean, once an environment goes like this, where you see all that black mustard right there, you're really going to see it coming back over and over again and getting thicker and thicker. And we've definitely been in those environments that have years of stacked mustard, and it's extremely difficult to deal with. But the sheep love it. It's a brassica. It's quite palatable to them, and it has a high nutritional value. And you can see they've stripped all the reproductive parts off of those plants right there, and munched it all down. And this is going to allow for a lot more native germination underneath those plants there. Now, here's an example of the Stipropulchra management that we were doing there. You can see here that there was a fence line in this photo, and one side was managed and one side was not managed, and it was right there. On the left side, we had grazed that through the summer, so you see much less thatch on the ground, but you also see a bunch grass that is responding excitedly to the disturbance, right? It's all fleshed out with green growth. This is actually, in this season, it was its second time flowering. So it's gone reproductive twice in one season as opposed to once. And you can see on the right hand side, this is the exact same patch. You can barely even tell that those are bunch grasses in there because they are so stacked with invasive grasses. So we don't, we don't always see such a positive response to those environments, but this is the kind of timing that we're always aiming for. And when weather allows, we can have really exaggerated effects like this. Here's another example of how thick the mustard can be. And you can see on the right-hand side of that fence line that the invasives are being effectively mitigated there. But also, the native grasses can actually be significantly less palatable to the animals. It's why, for instance, livestock managers have not preferred these native grasses. So you can go into an environment like this. This is at the Arroyo Hondo Preserve on the coast. And we can go in, and even when there's a sparse group of perennial grasses, by controlling the timing and the density of our grazing impact, we can go in and clear a lot of the invasives, and even leave some of these natives to continue to be reproductive. I mean, so you can see it's flowering right there. And then, of course, all that beautiful flowering mustard eventually turns into this gray mass you see on the right-hand side there. And that's the thing that really prevents germination in the beginning. So you can see how effectively on the left side of that fence there, sheep are able to knock that kind of thing down and really open things up. So our management program with Channel Island Restoration, it really is focused on grazing 2 times a year. The first time is early in the season, right when you have your first green flesh up, and really most of those plants are going to end up being invasive weeds or grasses. Those Mediterranean annuals are incredibly tenacious, and they really get up and go as soon as they can, whereas our natives tend to want to be waiting for a little bit of a warmer weather. So we can bring those animals in at that time, push that stuff back, and then as things heat up, you've got a little bit more sunlight penetration to the soil surface, and hopefully those natives have a chance to get up and above some of that stuff. And a lot of that stuff, for instance, your mustard, it will come back, but it is significantly reduced in its size and mass by an early grazing like that, whereas your grasses and some of your later starting annuals, they're going to be able to work a lot past that. And then a later season like this is intended to clear that soil surface. And again, thatching and the covering of soil surfaces is one of the major reasons we're seeing less and less of our native annuals and perennials germinating and surviving, because they're just not made to compete with this. I mean, we don't really know too deeply what exactly California native grasslands look like. You know, there's some debate back and forth whether it's stands of perennial grasses, thick and nothing but stipopulchra for miles, or whether it was predominantly forbs and wildflowers. There's kind of competing theories here, but none of uh, none of them were adapted to grow in environments like this that are so stacked and covered over. So in doing that management with Channel Island and at the San Marcos Foothills, we eventually saw the cave fire come in. Now, I don't have videos of the cave fire, but the cave fire came in through from the 154 off the highway, and it burned down and it burned right into the preserve. And as it burned into the preserve, it completely cooled down, really slowed, and the firefighting team pulled almost all their resources off of that area, sent one bulldozer in. That guy cut a line following the fire, and that effectively stopped the fire. A few years later, we were able to see the ASLA fire in person, and I took these videos so we can see here at Aurelia Ranch. These are ungrazed areas. This is actually the neighbor's property burning up towards the property that we have grazed. And this is another ranch where we had done some grazing. And this is a hillside that we hadn't grazed. These flames are maybe 30 feet tall. It's predominantly this annual vegetation, and it was moving extremely fast. Then this is an area that we did graze. I'm standing on a ridgetop looking down at it. Those flames are maybe 12 inches tall at the most. And it's moving very slowly, and even the places that are burning, it's not spreading into any of the canopies around it. It's not throwing ember cast big distances. It's having a very cool and manageable fire. And that, oh, I guess I'm. And then here are some of the other places where we did some grazing. This on the left-hand side is that same ranch you just saw. That slow fire just burned right up to this fence line where we were grazing, and then it stopped. This is the Arroyo Hondo Preserve. On the left-hand side where you see all that black char, that is where a cattle operation has been operating. They do a little bit less of a managed impact, and so it burned a little bit hotter, but then it stopped right when it hit our fence line. So that impact, got us really excited, and actually the cave fire, I think, is a predominant motivation behind the Santa Barbara Fire Safe Council writing a large CAL FIRE grant to try to do managed grazing as a regional strategy for fire fuel control. But before that, we had been managing with some of the other fire departments. So you can see here we're in the Parma Park area. We're working on a fuel break that stretches through the park. It's the largest park in Santa Barbara County, but it's very stacked with chaparral. So these animals were actually unfenced, and we're walking them along the fuel break, and they're creating sort of a spread mosaic effect where they're eating intensely the annuals on the top where we're traveling, but they're also spreading down into the shrubs, and they're managing reducing that fuel load in those shrubs. Then on the right-hand side, you see the Montecito Tea Gardens. That's stacked chaparral in there. And this is an area that I think had burned maybe 4 or 5 years earlier. So relatively new chaparral, but still getting overloaded. And this is a fenced area where we actually chainsawed lines through the chaparral and put these sheep in there. You can see here they're eating different common chaparral plants. This is the mountain mahogany on the left-hand side and the tree mallow on the right. Here is so we'll do some before and afters here. So here's some of the work that we did with, here's some of that annual treatment that you can see. These are stacked, these are thicker perennial grasses and chaparral community here. This is up in Montecito as well. And you can see how effectively the sheep brought that fuel load down in those areas. I believe this is, I don't actually know what grass this is. I thought it was a feather top, but they tend to not be quite so good at feather top, but but that's pretty impressive there. Here's that tea gardens area again, and you can see even this very thick chaparral, they can really reduce the overall volume. And I think a big emphasis of ours in our management is that all of these ecosystems, all of these plant communities, they have inherent value as well. We live in and amongst them, and they support the wildlife and the plant communities around us. They're places that people want to be. So we don't want to manage them by masticating them all or completely destroying them. And I think that this is a really beautiful example of the way that you can have mature and uh and and layers of chaparral and complexity in your ecosystem that is also very fire resilient. So all of the fine fuels, or the majority of the fine fuels, are kind of worked out of this area, and a lot of that, like vining, the kinds of things that wind up through those things, are taken down. Some of the chaparral, the more palatable chaparral, has been nibbled up so that there's less of the leafy vegetation. And whenever that stuff starts to grow back, when you have that regrowth, it tends to have a much higher moisture content than a old or senescent kind of chaparral. So, and chaparral in particular is interesting because it is most diverse after an intense disturbance. So often you'll see, after a fire goes through a chaparral plant community, you'll see wildflowers and manroot and bush poppies and all these like wonderful native annuals that you don't see a lot of, and that it'll stay a little bit more diverse and a little lower for about 3 to 5 years. And at that point, those kind of dominant chaparral species, your ceanothus and your sumac, they start to grow up and over things, and you really see them close that canopy out, and you see a lot less diversity in those plant communities after they've gone that far. So there are these opportunities to manage, particularly for native species, but also higher diversity than something that's completely left alone. Here's another just example of a weed stacked sort of, it's not a riparian area, but it's down in this draw. And some of what we are doing is just removing density. There's limiting amounts of what you can do actually in a fire fuel context. And some of it is just, can the fire burn a little bit slower? Can it burn a little less hot? And just that management in itself can really increase the firefighter's capacity to stop it. There's a lot of conversation about how to effectively use burn fuel breaks and that kind of thing, and whether or not they're even effective. But I think our question is, when there are opportunities to fight fire, it's not when there's 100 mile-an-hour wind maybe, but when the opportunity is appropriate with weather conditions, can we get in there and stop it effectively? Here's some just examples of different types of chaparral plants and the impact of the sheep grazing. This is coyote bush. You can see they really like that stuff. This is lemonade bush, which tends to have more of a varied effect, but this is them doing quite well on this lemonade berry. They're also even chewing on the bark a little bit. A lot of these chaparral plants are tricky to plan around because they change greatly from region to region and through the season, the levels of bitter compounds and tannins in those plants. So sometimes if you have a lemonade berry and you're trying to work on reducing that plant in particular, you might need to come in earlier in the season because it's much more palatable earlier in the season. Here is some toyon. You can see they've taken it up as far as they can reach it. And the other benefit of using these animals is they have all sorts of beautiful offputs instead of, the end result is really valuable. So we raise wool sheep. A lot of people don't raise wool sheep, but for this type of work, but we think that we can blend that management, and the fibers are an incredible resource that in California is often not utilized as much as it could be. Wool regulates body temperature, and it's incredibly it stays warm when it's wet, it doesn't stink, and it's incredibly fire resilient, which right now we're having some conversations about how to use wool for firefighter clothing as opposed to Nomex, which has an intense fire retardant chemical on it. And that chemical off gases. It off gases in UV conditions and it off gases in the heat. So the number one cause of death of firefighters, of on-duty firefighters in California is cancer. And that is cancer from all the sorts of chemicals that they have to encounter as they're fighting these fires. So wool's an incredible resource. This is how sheep look when they're all shaved. They look funny after their haircuts, just like you guys do. And here are the beautiful wool products that we produce. Yarns and hats and felting. And we also produce high quality lamb products that are raised from people's communities. And people get to see our animals out in their public parks and in their communities, and then they get to enjoy the meat from those products as well. So thanks for being interested, guys.
Thank you, Jack. That was great.
Thanks, Jack. I can go ahead and share my screen now if I can get that to work. Hold on. Okay. Is that visible to everybody with the presentation on it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, hi everybody. I'm Lauren Harris. I'm the staff ecologist for Channel Islands Restoration. Channel Islands Restoration is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're a pretty small organization and we work on habitat restoration on the California Channel Islands as well as on the mainland. Actually, a lot of our work is on the mainland, particularly at the San Marcos Foothills and some other locations here in Santa Barbara. We mostly do a lot of invasive plant management and native plant restoration projects, as well as some community engagement, education, research, and we work with a lot of volunteers as well. So for a little bit of context here, this is the San Marcos Foothills Preserve in the Santa Barbara region. So This is the city of Santa Barbara, and we're right up here in the foothills. And it's in the Wildland Urban Interface, which means that it's kind of right in between these backcountry, more natural terrain, as well as some urban areas and a lot of housing actually right in front of it. So when Jack was talking earlier about the cave fire that happened in 2019, having a area where the firefighters could stop the fire from advancing was really important for protecting the people and the homes in that area. In fact, Rob Hazard, who's the fire chief for Santa Barbara, said that the grazing program in particular was responsible for making it so that they could stop that fire from advancing. So the property right here, which is not exactly that square, but it falls within it, it's about 300 acres, and it is currently owned by the County of Santa Barbara. It was acquired by Channel Islands Restoration, Foothills Forever, and a couple other organizations and a ton of community members. And it has been managed by CIR, partially with grazing, partially with restoration projects. And the grazing itself has actually been something that we've been practicing at the San Marcos Foothills Preserve since 2018. So what I'm going to talk about today is more about the biological monitoring aspect, the research, the natural history of the area as well. So there's two main types of monitoring and research that we're doing out there right now. One of those is related to CEQA and the regulations that go with the grazing, because this is funded by federal money and it's on a lot of private and public lands for the Santa Barbara Fire Safe Council. There's some CEQA regulations which we have to follow. There was an environmental impact report, a bunch of specifications of things that must be met so that we can do our grazing. So the California Environmental Quality Act, this has a lot of restrictions of what we can and can't do, research that must be done beforehand. And I do the biological monitoring for the San Marcos Foothills Preserve, as well as a couple other sites that the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council does grazing at within the county. So when it comes to grazing, we know we're about to have some sheep come out to a site and do some grazing out there. I'll be doing some biological surveying in advance to look for things like rare plants, rare animals, habitats, and then make sure that the impacts of the grazing are not going to be impacting those sensitive species. So for the San Marcos Foothills Preserve, for example, we're supposed to watch out for riparian and woodland areas, riparian being like areas around rivers, and the buffer for that area is about 50 feet. So if I find a river on the property, we have to set back 50 feet from the river and also the type of habitat that surrounds it. We avoid native grasslands typically for the preserve because part of what we're doing out there is not just fuel reduction and wildfire mitigation, but it's actually habitat restoration. So the reason that we want to be doing all of this grazing is to encourage the growth of native plants and the native habitat that we have growing out there. So we typically avoid very, very native grasslands, which tend to be on the edges of the preserve on very steep areas, which we don't tend to graze anyways. We also avoid coastal scrub. So some of the photos that Jack was showing earlier were them grazing within scrub or in very like shrubby, densely vegetated areas. For the San Marcos Foothills Preserve, we don't typically graze in those areas because we're trying to promote that habitat and we don't see it as necessarily as much of a fire risk as like chaparral. So we have a very good buffer of grassland that we're grazing in between these urban areas and the backcountry that's right at the foothills. And for the coastal scrub, it's about 25 feet. There's also a lot of other species that I'm looking for when I'm doing this biological monitoring. In the bottom here, you can see a couple photos. The bottom right is Crotch's bumblebee, which is an endangered species of bumblebee. If you didn't know that existed, you're welcome. They're pretty cute. And I do surveying for these species to make sure that they're not living on the spots where we're going to be doing grazing. Bumblebees actually nest in the ground and they live in little burrows. So I survey to make sure that we're And this is a rare plant found pretty much only in Santa Barbara County. It tends to be found in more riparian areas, more shady areas. Isn't typically a problem for us when we're doing our grazing, but we do typically avoid this species, or always avoid this species. And on the left here is the Gaviota tar plant. We don't have this species at the San Marcos Foothills, but it's one of the ones that I survey for when I'm the biologist for the other project sites for the Fire Safe Council. So it's just another example of type of species that we avoid for legal reasons, but also because we care about protecting these really sensitive species. So speaking of protecting sensitive species and the biodiversity of the area, there's a lot of benefits from grazing, many of which Jack has covered already. Some of those, and speaking specifically in terms of native perennial grasses and grasslands, we're looking at getting a lot more carbon storage. Our native grasses have much deeper roots. They live for much longer. They're perennial, which means that they live for more than their just 1-year cycle, as opposed to our annual grasses, which in this area are typically not native. They die out quickly, they don't have as long roots, so they're not going to be storing as much carbon in the long term. Our native grasses also protect us from erosion, which can have a lot of effects when we're dealing with a wildfire, for example. We had the mudslides in Montecito a few years ago, and part of that is from the post-wildfire effects, removing the vegetation on the landscape and not having any kind of vegetation to like hold the land in place when the rains came in the winter. So the native grasses, especially when they reduce the wildfire risk of a site and we don't have wildfire coming through, are going to protect us from erosion in events like that, and also from just regular natural erosion that we get year-round because they have that deeper rooting. They also protect us more from drought. They hold on to water longer in the year. In the summer, when you see that the hills in California are really golden, part of that can be from native plants because they do have some leaves that tend to die in the summer. But part of it is actually a lot of the grasses that you're seeing on the hillside are annual species, invasive species. So when they hold on to water more throughout the summer, it creates better habitat, more water available for other species as well. So habitat for native species, fire resilience, protection for biodiversity, carbon erosion. Native grasslands are pretty important in California, so we really try to protect them at the foothills and elsewhere. This is actually a picture of a beetle I found during some other surveying, which is actually just to hide the part where we talk about how do we know that we're actually doing the grazing correctly. And we've talked a lot about different methods for conducting it correctly, making sure that we're in the correct habitat, for example. But what are the metrics that we're taking and the data that we're looking at to make sure that it's actually having the effect that we're expecting? So one of those metrics is the proportion of thatch versus bare ground. So Jack talked earlier about how the dead non-native species that cover the ground after their annual cycle is complete are actually really in the way of new native species germinating from seed on that ground. So thatch is that like dead ground up plant material that you might find sitting on the surface of soil. And typically it gets in the way of our native species. So when we have more bare ground as opposed to thatch, we know that the grazing is helping and going to be encouraging native growth. Additionally, the proportion of native to non-native species, I think this one mostly speaks for itself, but native species are part of a really intricate web that we have here in California. So the grazing is supposed to directly increase the proportion of native species in our habitats. We also care a lot about biodiversity. We don't want to have just one species everywhere. A lot of our grasslands do tend to be our native purple needlegrass or Cypopolcra, but there are also a lot of other species found within them. And in the picture down here, you can actually see a number of like different wildflowers popping up in the spring that we tend to get in our grasslands. So this is an example of some of the biological surveying that I do at the San Marcos Foothills for the grazing. The bottom left, these two photos are actually showing one of our monitoring poles that we have out there. And these poles are in the same spot every year. They stay there all the time. And we come back every year and take data from these exact spots so that we know how the preserve vegetation is changing over time. And on the left, you can see what it looks like when it's green and before it's been grazed. On the right, here's like a post-grazing slightly later in the year. And we have 30 of these plots across the San Marcos Foothills Preserve, including a number of controls where we actually don't graze, specifically so that we can compare it later to see how that grazing is impacting the plants that we have out there. We take a lot of metrics that I mentioned a little bit already. Relative cover is going to be every single plant that we find in that big circle that we have, that like 15-foot radius circle. Every plant and the proportion that it covers within that area. The thatch, bare ground, and plant cover, the number of burrows, and whether or not there's been any herbivory. So we have some research that has been done already for the foothills. From 2018 to 2022. So let me pull up the notes for this one because I have some actual statistics for that, if I can find them. Okay. I might have to find those later, but I do know that we've seen an increase in native plant density, an increase in the proportion of Stipa pulchra, our native needlegrass, a reduction in thatch, an increase in the bare ground, so that change between having a lot more bare area for our native plants to be seeding into and growing out of. So far it seems pretty successful, the grazing that we've been doing. The native species are becoming more abundant as well as more diverse. And it seems like the grazing so far is helping quite a bit at the San Marcos Foothills. So here's a little map, actually. Maybe I should have put this earlier. The San Marcos Foothills Preserve boundary is in black here. The green areas are everywhere that we're grazing on the preserve, typically every year. And the red spots are these points where we have either an experimental survey point or a control point. I didn't differentiate them in the color here, but some of them we'd actually do fence off within these grazed areas so that we have something to compare to later. And we have a lot of areas where we're taking data on the preserve, and a lot of the preserve gets grazed. So remember I said earlier, this is 300 acres. I'd say maybe 100 of that ends up getting grazed every year. So from this, we've got pretty good results so far of our data that we've been collecting. Let's see. We're continuing to take data, and we have another graze planned for later this year in about September. If you want to come out to the foothills and look at the sheep, it's a publicly accessible preserve, so you're welcome to do that. And we're going to be continuing to take the data and make sure that the type of and the methods of grazing that we're doing are successful out of the preserve. So, all right, thank you. And Jack, do we have another person from Fire Safe Council that we want to hear from today?
I'm working on getting him in, but
Okay.
but
Maybe
yeah,
we can do some
he's out there.
questions or something in
I
the
think
meantime.
he's happy to answer questions from the fire perspective, but he's not in.
Okay, no worries. All right, thank you.
I do see some questions in the chat. Maybe we can go through those. And maybe if you want to answer some questions, Lauren, and I can help get Nick in the chat. Let's see.
Should we start from the top or the bottom? There's a lot of questions
Yeah,
here.
maybe start from the top. There's a lot of.
Okay.
I see one. The first one was from Craig Carlton. It was, are you checking the soil nutrients and organic matter levels in the top 2 inches? Do you see that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't believe that's part of what we're measuring. But yeah, I'm curious about what you're finding out there. What I have often heard is that excess nitrogen favors annual invasives. So it was actually a concern at one point that too much manuring would create an annual flush, but we're not seeing that. You know, I do think that the consuming of those annuals and then manuring them back onto the soil is actually a net addition to organic matter as opposed to a removal if they're managed effectively. I'm super curious. I mean, you're saying here that you're having a super bloom after you put some fertilizer down, so maybe we should check out what you're doing. Lauren, I don't know if you had anything to add to that, but
Yeah, we haven't been taking any soil measurements for these areas. I have also heard that sometimes adding additional nutrients to native landscapes can make it so that the non-natives are more easily able to outcompete the natives. It depends on the site sometimes, I guess, but I've heard the same as you, Jack. And I see, Craig, that you mentioned having some serpentine in there. Are they serpentine endemic plants that are benefiting from this, would you say? Do you know?
Yeah, the Kyle Preserve is on the edge of I-280 and 2.3 billion cars driving by over the last 50 years. Right next to the 280 fence is where our best serpentine natives grow. So what we did is we tested the soil where the natives were growing well, and then tested where they weren't growing well, where the weeds were growing. We had massive amounts of wild oats and ryegrass, and we have $10 million homes around the edge of the preserve. So getting those weeds converted to wildflowers has reduced the amount of fire fuel by 98% in the summer. And this spring, because of the drought we had in January, there was 1 acre where the wildflower seedlings did not have enough nutrients. We had to put 1,000 pounds organic fertilizers on that 1 acre. And that's the only reason why those wildflowers are blooming right now. And it's also the best blooming area on the entire 14-acre preserve, if anybody wants to come and visit. I'd be willing to give anybody a tour if you just send me an email and tell me when you're coming and show you where we get rid of the weeds by fertilizing and get the wildflowers to grow back.
that's really awesome, Craig. Thank you. And I think it is a good time to mention that, like, grazing by itself is not going to be able to bring back native grasslands or the native California environment. These environments are intensely colonized, and they will likely never be what they were. You know, we often try to think of restoration, or we're trying to bring these environments back, or looking back at how our environments were. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are going to be many strategies, that grazing is going to be something that can play a role in management and maybe make your restoration efforts more effective or more cost effective, but it may not be the only tool you need to use if your goal is restoration of grasslands in particular. And also, that was an important point, that just by creating that native environment, you reduce the fire fuel load by 98% in that area. That's incredible. And these California native landscapes, they are very fire resistant. They do burn much more safely than these invaded environments. And I think that they deeply require management. We have a belief that leaving these environments is what is natural, but these environments have been tended for thousands of years before they were invaded by these invasives. Indigenous Californians were burning and managing these lands intensively. So we need to understand that now is a time for us to be managing these lands as well. And I think that the grasslands in particular, 1% of native grasslands are left in California of what there once were. And a native grassland is only defined by having 10% native grasses. So that's an incredibly vanishing amount of what once was present. And so it follows that over 90% of our endangered species in California live in and around grasslands because they're vanishing. And so if there are opportunities for us to invest the intensive management in areas that also reduce fire risk to our communities, that are also pleasant places for us to be and to observe, places that are stacked with wildflowers, that are easy to walk through and not so stacked with chaparral, but that they are also habitats for our most critically endangered species. I think that that's a win all around, but it does require consistent management. And that is what grasslands around the world have always told us. They're in relationship with grazers and fire. And we need to also be in relationship with those things.
Can I chime in one more minute? Since
Sure.
1992, I've restored 800 acres of grasslands in California. And when I say restored, that means 95% or better native cover. What we're doing at Kite Hill right now is we're finding that underneath the weeds all over California are dormant native seeds. Once you get the nutrients back in shape, you mow the weeds so they don't reproduce more viable seeds, the natives are coming up at the rate of 5 to 10 seedlings per square inch. We're unearthing an entire grassland ecosystem from dormant seeds that we estimate to be between 100 and 250 years old. So it's time to take advantage of these seeds that are in the soil all over California. Wherever you haven't plowed the land, those seeds are still there in our grasslands. We just need to add the nutrients, find out what those nutrient levels should be from existing stands. Poppies are a good test case to use because they take the highest nutrient levels normally. And my big issue with grazing is my major native grass isn't the perennials. It's the annual Festuca microstachys. You start grazing that at the wrong time of year, you lose that species. And the rat-tailed fescue will come in and take its place. It's just waiting on the sidelines. We get rid of our natives, those weeds are ready to take over. So come and see Kite Hill, do your test plots. We're setting up test plots at the Cuyama College, which is half a mile north. In 6 months, we're getting solid native cover just by adding the nutrients back. Solid native cover in former wild oat, yellow star thistle grasslands. If the students at Cuyama College
great.
can do it on a square meter, everybody in California can start doing it right now in their grasslands too.
Thank you, Craig. I appreciate you giving us your experience. I just want to make sure and get a few more questions in. I saw that John Chan had asked if there's a conversation in the landscape architecture community about the extensive proliferation of wildflowers in pre-agricultural California. That I don't know about that, if there is a conversation about that right now. Does anyone?
I also, go ahead.
No,
No,
go
you
ahead.
go ahead. Well, yeah, I don't know about in the landscape architecture community, but definitely in the grazing and grassland community, there's a lot of conversation about whether or not by grassland, when the Spanish were writing about grasslands, they were actually referring to extensive wildflower communities. So maybe that's what you're referring to there, John.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm not part of the landscape architect community, but wildflowers are a pretty important part of our native grasslands, especially in those that were managed by indigenous peoples. Things that were burned over the years tend to have a lot more wildflowers in the years following them immediately. So there's a pretty interesting connection between the way that these lands have been managed historically by indigenous people for thousands of years, as Jack was mentioning earlier.
I also see this question here about have the projects been met with regulatory hurdles? And I see that Nick Elmquist is with us. And Nick, I was wondering if you would be willing to talk about some of the regulatory issues that you've had bringing grazing into your vegetation management program.
Sure, thanks, Jack. Sorry I missed the previous meeting. I had a prior engagement, so if I cover anything that may have already been touched on, let me know. But in the state, obviously there's been a push from CAL FIRE to use the vegetation management program, the CAL VTP, as a way to programmatically look at these sites in terms of more of a landscape planning purpose. We've done it both for the Santa Barbara County Fire Safe Council and then specifically here in Montecito Fire, trying to look at it as a 10-year plan of identifying sites could potentially be treated, and this includes grazing, and then typically hiring a consulting company to come out and do the regulatory process through CEQA to meet all those requirements. And we've been fairly successful. It's not cheap. So it takes a fairly, robust funding mechanism, which the state also has been providing recently. So it seems to be a fairly opportune time to both meet the environmental requirements, but then also trying to look at a larger landscape scale and think about fire mitigation in the long term.
Yeah, and I think on our part, we've seen that grazing tends to have less regulatory issues, it feels like, than a lot of other treatments that might disturb the soil surface more, or if you go in with a masticator, all these kinds of things, there's triggers heavier levels of regulation than we've really seen with the sheep. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is creating new roads triggers a whole more robust environmental analysis portion. And so obviously a limiting factor in doing hand treatments is distance to a road, because you're not going to be able to drag shrubs to the chipper, especially on steep slopes. You're pretty limited by topography. So by grazing, it all obviously depends on vegetation type, but it allows you some opportunity to not have to create any additional roads, but you could manage the herd appropriately and strategically place water and things like that, which you guys probably already talked about, but to kind of reduce the impacts on the land.
I had a question. Would most of your funding have come from CAL FIRE? Is that where most of it comes from?
Yeah, almost all of it in terms of, large landscape. For our Santa Barbara County prescribed herbivory project came through the California Climate Investment Act that's passed through the wildfire mitigation that's managed by CAL FIRE. Our department is relatively small, and so we'll set aside a limited amount each year just to do our own grazings at a smaller scale here in Montecito.
And then where do you do it in Montecito? Because Montecito's it's highly residential. So
yeah, it is. We've looked, but on the north side, really the intermix between the Los Padres National Forest and the wildlands to the north, getting into the northern part of our community. We've been treating that area for several decades, working with the community owners or the parcel owners to create a buffer. And after the 2017 Thomas fire that burned most of that area, we tried to use that short period or that short window to try to create a larger buffer between the infrastructure and the wildlands. And there's several, larger open spaces within the community itself that there's trail foundations that always been a big part of the community. So there's these open spaces that the topography and the fuels types are right that we've been treating as well.
We're 4 minutes out. Does anyone have any questions, especially fire mitigation questions?
I see a question in the chat that I want to address about if there's any upcoming prescribed burn projects. Eric, are you speaking specifically about the San Marcos Foothills?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. We don't have anything planned out there for a prescribed burn. Unfortunately, it is really close to a lot of housing and a lot of people, which makes it pretty hard to get community support for that or even to do it safely. So we don't have anything coming up for that, which is why we're mostly doing a lot of other types of methods to restore the habitat out there, including grazing, planting, other things.
Well, I just want to say we're coming close to the end. I really appreciate Nick. I really appreciate you coming in towards the end and answering more questions. And Lauren and Jack, this has been really informative. I think that's part of why we don't have a lot of questions, because there's probably more answered than we even thought to ask about. It's really interesting. And I do see one question about how do you deal with the need to have grazing over many years?
Well, and I'll kind of touch in on this other question about whether there was spring grazing this year. It's always an issue of planning and having the animals available and then looking at the timing. So this year, we didn't get rains in time to have appropriate timing with the animals across the preserve. We didn't bring them in this year. It's also a lower rainfall year, so a better year for natives often to germinate, a little less competition overall. So the other thing that we do, an issue is being able to afford management over that time. Doing this kind of grazing, it's not like, you're getting a cattle lease and the feed for the animals is worthwhile. For the animals, it's really a service that folks are providing. They're bringing in the fence and the equipment, and so it is costly, or it costs something anyway. And so, yeah, we need to establish strategies of long-term funding. The Fire Safe Council, for their fire management strategies, created a 3-year plan, and we were able to retreat some areas over that season. At the San Marcos Foothills, Channel Island wrote a grant that was 3 years of management to improve ground nesting bird habitat. And now they're even trying to establish a fund that would pay for ongoing management. So it's always a difficulty. It's all, we'd like to be able to put something in place and walk away, but I don't think that we get to do that and have a safe fire environment.
I do have to say that after the fires in Los Angeles, it was pretty clear about how expensive things can be when we don't do anything. So that was very eye-opening as far as the cost of grazing overall.
I see Ada has her hand up there.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Jack and Lauren. This was super informative, and I think it's really important to be having this conversation, discussing various ways of reducing fuel loads as fire season becomes longer and harsher. And I also wanted to give a quick shout out. I work for White Buffalo Land Trust, which was briefly mentioned in the beginning. We're a regenerative agricultural nonprofit. We have a 1,000-acre ranch up in Jalama, about like a 50-minute drive from Santa Barbara City. And we have an upcoming field day on April 12th, and I'll drop a link in the chat if anyone's interested. I've been up here today. We got some cattle up here, and we're going to be rotationally grazing them, implementing a lot of the things we were talking about in this seminar. So I'd love to see some of y'all out there. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so
Mhm.
much. And I know that some people wanted to know how to reach out with more questions. Maybe I can send your emails out to people if that's okay with you both.
Totally fine. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us today. It was really interesting.
Thanks,
Fantastic.
everyone.
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Thanks, Alyssa.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.